This is just a picture of the Big Fork River in Minnesota that flows down into Rainy River, taken in late April to give you a sense of some of the tributary flows. We'll come back to that later. So there are going to be a number of key points I'll cover. I'm going to summarize them at the start and then again at the end of the presentation. The first is that by the end of March, we had a moderately high snowpack in the basin. It was not extraordinarily high in most areas, aiming for moderate to moderately high freshet flows. However, April completely changed the picture. We had record precipitation across most regions of the larger Winnipeg River watershed, coupled with a delayed thaw. And with that delayed thaw and a great deal of precipitation built up through the month of April on top of the snowpack from the winter, we have a classic rain on snow situation. So rain plus rapid snow melt over frozen ground, leading to very high flows. Many of these areas around the basin saw record flows for this time of year, or are seeing them right now. And the timing for this, unfortunately, is very poor. We're headed into what are typically the wettest weeks of the year in May and June and into early July, without a lot of hot weather and evaporation to help ameliorate things. So we very likely have weeks of high water ahead in almost all regions of the watershed, and how long this lasts and how high things get is completely dependent on how much rain falls over the next number of weeks. In terms of the magnitude of this event, water levels that were seen in 2014 in all regions of the watershed could be reached again. Higher levels are possible if we get a lot of rain over the next number of weeks. It is possible we will not reach 2014 peaks if the weather is relatively dry and there's an opportunity for the current water in the system to work its way out. I'd like to first start off with an overview of the watershed, since we have a lot of people from all over the basin. This is the Winnipeg River drainage basin outlined in orange. So all of any rain or snow that falls in this area will eventually run out into Lake Winnipeg if it doesn't evaporate. And this area is larger than the Maritime provinces and roughly the size of the state of Illinois, I believe, and can be divided into two main components. So to the north, we have the English River Basin, roughly along this line here. It flows from the upper reaches of the basin to the east of Sioux Lookout, up through Sioux Lookout into Lac Seul, which is the largest lake in this region. Collects runoff from different areas into the English River, which then flows down to join the Winnipeg River just before flowing into Manitoba. To the south, we have the Rainy Lake of the Woods system. It includes the Lac Qui subbasin, which flows into Namakan Lake. Namakan Lake flows into Rainy Lake. There's a number of other tributaries that come from Ontario down into Rainy Lake. The dam at Fort Frances International Fall drains Rainy Lake directly into Rainy River, which is the main tributary to Lake of the Woods. And additional significant flows can come out of the Fork Rivers in Minnesota into Rainy River. These are natural rivers which have no regulation. Lake of the Woods collects water mostly from this larger upper basin through the Rainy River, but there is some local runoff as well, and flows out of the dams in Kenora into the headwaters of the Winnipeg River. The Winnipeg River flows from Kenora down to the White Dog Dam near Menaki, which is a run-of-river dam, which passes the flow as it arrives down into the lower Winnipeg River in Manitoba, where it combines with the English River. So the flows down the Winnipeg River in Manitoba through the White Shell are combining all of this region in terms of the drainage before it flows down into Lake Winnipeg. So now that we're situated, I just want to take a break, a moment here to talk about the various subbasins. So I talked about the larger basin, all that water that falls into that region will eventually end up in Lake Winnipeg and further downstream. This can be further divided into smaller sections, and I'm going to be talking about subbasin precipitation. So when I do talk about that, is basically on a given day, how much rain fell within the boundaries of one of these areas that will drain to a certain point. So for example, the Lake of the Woods subbasin, rainfall that falls within this blue boundary and that will eventually flow out through Kenora. On a given day, you take the average for all of the rainfall over that area, and that is the basin average for that day. And we compute this at the Secretariat every day for each of these subbasins. So precipitation is going to be the main theme of the talk here today. And we're going to look at a few precipitation graphs, and I just want to take a moment to review what these look like. So these are on the website for those that are familiar, but if you're not, we basically tally up how much rain falls each week or quarter month and add it all together, and that's what the blue column is. So you're looking at, for this particular graph here, just as an example, starting last July in 2021, and then running up until the current time. The black line indicates the average precipitation that we typically see at that time of year for that week, and that's over a 30-year period. So the black line basically gives you a frame of reference or some way to evaluate, is this high or low precipitation? So if you see a lot of white below the black line, that's a very dry period. If the blue column is a lot higher than the black line, then that's a very wet period for that time of the year. So with that stage set, how did we get to a very high flow situation that we're talking about tonight? This is a picture of the Big Fork River that we saw earlier from August of last year, a very different situation where we had drought conditions across the entire Winnipeg River Basin, some of the worst drought conditions in many decades, and exceptional drought down in the Minnesota area. And so how do we go from that in 2021 to very high flows now? Well, for spring floods, there are a number of ingredients, and I'm going to come back to this slide a few times. So this is basically the water cycle, basic hydrology, and when you're talking about spring floods, there are a number of key factors that can contribute to a very high flow situation. The first of these is high base flows, and what I mean by base flows is just the natural stream flows that are happening in small and larger tributaries all around the watershed. If they're at a relatively low level, that indicates that there's capacity in the ground in the watershed to absorb water. If they're at a relatively high level, that means there's very limited room in the soil to store water. So if you have high base flows coming out of the previous fall heading into a winter, that means there's limited capacity once the ground thaws to absorb extra water. If the base flows heading into the winter are low, however, that means there is capacity once that ground is thawed to absorb water. The next risk factor is high water content in the snowpack. So if we've got a lot of snow on top of the ground, and that snow is relatively wet, so the water content in snow can vary depending on the weather conditions. That, of course, is just water that is ready to melt and move right into the system. Frozen ground is another key factor at this time of year. Even if there is room in the soil, if that ground is frozen, it's not getting in. It will completely run off, head for the nearest small stream, and eventually work its way down to the larger rivers and lakes. The most important of all these factors, however, is the timing and the amount of the spring rainfall. So if there's a gradual melt and just normal precipitation here and there, the whole watershed's worth of snowpack can run off in a moderate way and can be handled by the various dams in the system without getting to a high flow condition. However, if you get into a rain on snow situation, things can quickly deteriorate. I'm going to take a look at a few of these sub-basin precipitation areas, starting with the Lac Seul Basin. So this graph goes from June of 2021 through the extreme drought period that we saw last summer up until the end of March. So you can see these back in June and July, the deficits here in terms of the water, and we're getting into the hot summer period. Water levels are very low up through the Lac Seul Basin. We do start to see some weeks with more precipitation. It certainly helps, but it doesn't overcome the drought. As we get into the end of November, flows are starting to pick up into the very low normal range. And then the freeze really hits towards the end of November into December and doesn't let up all winter. So all of this precipitation from December 1st onwards is really accumulating snowpack because we didn't have any melt period. Some of that snow can go up into the air through sublimation, but we probably didn't see much of that this winter. So you can see a number of weeks we had quite a bit above average snowfall in the Lac Seul Basin in a number of weeks, and a few weeks below normal, but overall certainly a healthy snowpack by the end of March accumulating. Now if we move on to include April and up to May 8th, you can see we had a lot more precipitation added to the system. Some of these are many multiples of the average that you would typically see in April, 7, 8, 9 times as much as you would typically get in a week. And it's week after week after week for 7 weeks. So the next graph is another way of looking at this, and called these cumulative precipitation graphs, starting in December and coming up until today. And basically all you do here is add on each day's amount of precipitation across the subbasin, adding on to the previous day. So it just keeps going up and up as you get more precipitation. And at the end of the graph, you can see the total amount that has fallen. since the start of December. What's important to point out here, the graph on the right is basically the same graph here, just with the quarter month totals. So by the end of April, we've had 168 millimeters of precipitation since December 1st. And then from April 1st until today, basically, we've got 326. So not quite double, but almost double the amount of precipitation we had in the previous 4 months in about 5 weeks. Really changed the situation. I'm going to shift gears and go down to the Rainy Lake of the Woods Basin, just because I know there's been some concern about how much snow was in the watershed and how regulation was handled. So this slide and the next one were presented at a meeting of the IGC board for Rainy and Namakan Lakes at the end of March. And this is snow depth maps provided by the Department of Natural Resources out of Minnesota. So we're only seeing Minnesota here, of course. But it's to give some context relative to other years. So on the right, we have this year, the last week of March. The middle was 3 years ago, 2019, which you might remember, but you probably don't because it was an unremarkable spring, totally normal flows and level management through that period. And 2014 was the last very high water level in spring period through the Rainy Lake of the Woods system. So you can see quite a bit more snowpack at the end of March in 2014, whereas this year, very similar to 2019, a bit more. Now the map, of course, only includes Minnesota. There was more definitely up around Kenora, and you can see it here all around Lake of the Woods. But the vast majority of the watershed is not right around Kenora and the north end of Lake of the Woods. It's in this area, and other data sources indicate that we had similar amounts on the Ontario side. This pocket up towards Lake Superior here had very high snowpack amounts, but that's not in the watershed. This snow will melt and drain off into Lake Superior. Snow depth is a good indicator. It's important to kind of put that in context of other years. So this is the snow depth ranking, so comparison to past years. Light purple is 99 percentiles. 99% of years are lower than this year. So in 2014, a large part of the boundary waters area was at near record or record at the end of March. This year, however, we're down in sort of the upper normal range, 60 to 80%, but a large pocket here is actually down in just around the average normal range around the Namakan Lac La Croix system, and that was similar on the Ontario side. Comparison to 2019, a bit less, but kind of a comparable year, 2019 to 2022 by the end of March. The snow depth is important, but what's more important, of course, is how much water is in that snow, and that can vary depending on the density of the snow. These maps that I'm going to show you are from the American Weather Service, NOAA, and they're a measurement of how much water is in the snow. So if you melt that snow, how deep would that snow be compared to just liquid water? And you can see larger pockets around the border, again, around Rainy and Namakan Lake. We're getting up 6, perhaps 8 to 10 inches of snow water equivalent. The product this year did not perform well in the northern part, so I'm not considering this, and certainly the board wasn't considering this as accurate up around Kenora. But down in this region where, of course, the Americans are more interested in what's happening in the US, it certainly was consistent with snow measurements that were being taken. So that's 2022. If we compare it to 2019, you can see there was quite a bit more water in the snow by the end of March. Again, this is March 31st. And then again, looking back to 2014 and the lead up to the very high water levels in the spring of that year, there was a lot more snow water in the snowpack at the closing of March. So main point here, by the end of March, not seeing exceptional amounts of snow, but there's a very healthy snowpack in the basin on top of a very dry watershed where we still had moderate drought conditions all through this region of Minnesota at the end of March. So taking a look now at these precipitation graphs like we did for Lac Seul for the Rainy Namakan Basin and the Lake of the Woods subbasin. Again, we saw this very dry period in 2021. Getting into the fall, we have a few weeks with well above normal precipitation. That's certainly helping the drought situation. Drought is not resolved. Base flows in the system heading into November are creeping up into the normal range again, but they're at the low end. And again, similar to Lac Seul, we'll get into a pretty deep freeze in December and the starting accumulation of the snowpack in the basin. Quite a bit of snow in December builds up and it kind of provides an insulating layer on the lakes as they're freezing. And we have a few weeks with well above normal snow accumulation down the Lake of the Woods basin, 3 straight weeks in February, and to close out March above normal snow in the rainy Namakan Basin. So pretty healthy snowpack by the end of March, not exceptional. Advancing again into April, you just see these bars get much bigger, and it's just that consistency again. So 5 or 6 straight quarter-month periods with many multiples of the average precip that we would typically see in April for both the rainy Namakan and the Lake of the Woods Basin. Looking again at the cumulative precipitation, so just basically adding up all that rain we saw and snow that we saw in the last graph from December. This is for the rainy Namakan Basin. And by the end of March, 177 millimeters accumulated since December 1st. And as of today, 332. So not quite double, but pretty close to double the precipitation that we had over the 4 months since December 1st, since the start of April. The Lake of the Woods, similar numbers, 155 by the end of April, but 337. So actually more than double the precipitation we had over the winter in the last 5 or 6 weeks. So this really is the tale here. It's this addition of a sudden and extreme amount of precipitation all across the basin. Another way to look at this is on maps, and these maps are produced by the American and Canadian weather services. The top left is Northern Canada, and this is a percent of normal precipitation in April. So you can see all around the English River basins, Lookout, Lac Seul down to the Winnipeg River basin, you're over 400% of normal precipitation for this area. And of course, all around the Winnipeg area, all through the news, a lot of flooding concerns there. But even up in the upper reaches of the rainy Namakan Basin, we're still seeing 250, 275, like 3 times as much as normal as you would see in April. And that's consistent with what the American estimates are, 300 to 400% of normal precipitation from April 5th to May 5th. Last map to look at here, this is from the Manitoba Hydrologic Forecast Center, and this is April percent of normal precipitation. So they're estimating pretty much the same thing, very high amounts in the Winnipeg River Basin and north end of Lake of the Woods, 400 to 500%, but even higher amounts down through the White Shell, 500 to 600% of normal precip in this smaller area. The larger basin upstream seeing 300 to 400% of normal. What this means in terms of overall statistics for the month of April, if you look at each of those subbasins we saw on the map earlier, all of them except for Lac La Croix, which is at the far eastern part of the rainy Lake of the Woods system, set new records. And most of these have over 100 years of records for April precipitation. So the first column here is the precip in April this year. The second column is the previous record, so you can do kind of a quick comparison to see what the difference is. For example, Lake of the Woods had about 25 or about an inch higher, which is about 25% higher than the previous record, let alone compared to normal. Previous record was from 1986. The rainy Namakan Basin, 123, is actually tied with the amounts that we had in 2001. Another factor, we talked about the frozen ground being an important item, but the delayed thaw. So this graph here is the temperature data for April for Kenora. And it's kind of busy, so I'll take a minute to explain it here. This orange line is the average daily temperature, the high temperature recorded in Kenora. I don't know what the full period for the average is, but just again, to give you a sense of what's normal. And then the blue line is the average low temperature for the day. So anything that's falling kind of in between here would be considered, sort of normal range. So the month actually starts off pretty normal. We had some daytime highs above freezing, and we're starting to see some melt happening, and the board is increasing flows gradually out of Lake of the Woods in response to this. However, then we start to see heavier precipitation falling, and then the deep freeze in the middle of April. And the first of the Colorado lows starts passing through, dumping a ton of snow. That snow is not melting. Some of the rainfall that fell early in the month isn't making its way down to the system yet. It's getting locked up in the snowpack. And it's just it's kind of a holding pattern as more and more precipitation is added to the basin, and we don't see that gradual thaw that's typical of April. Finally, by the end of the month, we're starting to see those heavy rainfall amounts, and the warmer temperatures are picking up, and that's when we start to see the really rapid pickup in flows in the basin. So taking a look again at our spring flood ingredients, at the end of April, sort of the last week, we don't have high base flows across the watershed yet. That's still the same situation as it was heading into the winter. largely because the ground is still frozen. There's a lot of snow left on top. There's a very high water content in the snowpack due to the additional snow added onto the overwinter snow, plus the rain that's trapped in there. The ground is still frozen in most of the basin. And the most important factor, the timing and amount of spring rainfall. So we're getting a lot of rain dumped on top of that very substantial snowpack at this point. Very little of that rain is making its way down into the ground. It's all running off into streams, eventually down into the main tributaries and lakes. And there's virtually no evaporation or transpiration from plants happening. So this is basically the classic rain on snow effect. So if you consider what's happening on the ground at the end of April and heading into May, you basically had this month of very high precipitation, just taking Lake of the Woods as an example, but it's the same across the upper parts of the Lake of the Woods system. And you can consider this really just to be a sudden washout of all of this snowpack that's built up over the previous weeks, but also extending back, of course, through the winter snowpack that's been built up. So even just considering the precip that fell in April, you've got over probably 120 millimeters of built up precip. So hard to put those numbers into context. Is that a lot? Is that obviously compared to a weekly average? So let's take a step back about 20 years to 2002. In 2002, Lake of the Woods was kind of at the low normal range. Everything was going great, middle of June, and then the 49th parallel storm came through. This is the biggest rain event in the history of sort of Northwest Ontario. It was centered around Atikokan, but Lake of the Woods certainly saw a ton of rain from this event. So in one quarter month, we saw about 120 mils of rainfall, and then the next week, another 50 mils. Huge amount of water. It's the only time that the Lake of the Woods went from basically fully closed in terms of logs at the Norman Dam to fully open in a couple of days in response, because there was so much water coming down through the system. So this is comparable to what we're seeing today, except we have frozen ground, whereas they didn't have frozen ground then. And it was the middle of June, so you've got plants drawing up a lot of water and evaporation happening. So the main point of this is to kind of illustrate this is a lot of water coming down through the system. So shifting from the end of April into early May, we now do have high base flows across much of the watershed because some of the ground has thawed, and these tributaries are picking up very, very quickly, and the storage in the ground is getting filled up. It's kind of a mixed bag in terms of the water content in the snowpack. A lot of the snowpack is left by early May down in the Fork River basins, for example, around some areas of rainy Namakan. So some areas have snow, but a lot don't. And in terms of frozen ground, those areas that don't have snow are also thawing out earlier. Up in the English River, Lac Seul, Packwash area, we still have a lot of snow on the ground and a lot of frozen ground. Timing and amount of spring rainfall, we've had a lot of rain in the last couple of weeks, more just over the past weekend. So we're getting just sort of add insult to injury here, more water than the system can handle, and that's almost all turning into runoff that's heading downstream. So what that means in terms of flows across the basin, this map shows gauge locations where flow is measured or computed in streams or into the major lakes across the basin. Anywhere where there's a red star has seen a new record for flow for early May. Not necessarily an all-time record. We have seen higher flows sort of in June and July in some areas. Green stars are locations that haven't quite reached a record, but probably will in the next few days, just because they haven't had enough melt time yet. So to highlight here, record inflows into all the major lakes. So Lac Seul is seeing record high May inflows. Lake of the Woods is seeing record high May inflows. Rainy and Namakan Lakes seeing record high May inflows. Outflows, however, are not at a record high for Lac Seul, and record high outflows are not happening out of Lake of the Woods for early May. The flows down through the Winnipeg River are not at a record high for early May at this point. So one last touch on this slide, just to taking a look ahead into the rest of May and June, again, emphasizing the importance of the timing and amount of spring rainfall. Unfortunately, as mentioned earlier, May and June tend to be the wettest months of the year heading into early July. It certainly doesn't mean that we have to have wet weather, but it wouldn't be abnormal. So the expectation is likely that we will see continued moderate or higher rainfall over the next number of weeks, and this is just going to add to the difficulty of the situation. And in early May, until the greening up starts happening in the trees and plants start drawing in a lot of water, we can't rely on a lot of water being pulled out of the ground that way. It is actually a significant effect on the watershed once it happens. And with cooler temperatures compared to summer, we won't see a lot of evaporation. So still ripe for very high flow conditions. The next part of the presentation is going to look at the various graphs around the basin. We have people from all over the basin on the call, so I just want to touch on all of the major areas to make sure everyone has a sense of what's going on. To do that, I'm going to be looking at some graphs, and I just want to mention a couple of statistical things for those who might not be familiar with our data products. So I'll mention the word percentile. It's a common statistic term. It's very simple. It's just the percent of the years when a flow or a water level was lower than the current level. So if I say we're at a 70th percentile flow for the first week of May, it means in past years, 70% of those years were lower than it is today. If it's a 90th percentile, it's 90% of those years. What that means on a graph, the red line here is the 90th percentile. So as you go from January to December, you can see that I think this is for Lake of the Woods. I can't remember which graph, it doesn't matter. The red line is 90th percentile. So if you're at that line, 90% of the years were lower than that value. The yellow band is what we call the normal range. So that's between 25th percentile and 75th percentile. So the middle 50%, if you will. So anything below the top of the yellow range, 75% of those years were lower than the top of the yellow band. So starting in the English River Basin upstream of Lac Seul, so these are rivers that flow down into the Sioux Lookout area. Again, the upper red line is the 90th percentile, 90% of years lower than this value. We are more than double the 90th percentile here for the Sturgeon River flow. McDougall Mill is just a very high flow, and it is rising rapidly with rapid snowmelt, significant snowpack. Almost the same flow coming out of the English River at Umfraville. These again flow down towards Lac Seul, rising very quickly here. So we expect to see much higher flows. At Lac Seul, this is the Lac Seul level shown here. So we're about at the top of the normal range for early May. It's not a high level yet, but it is rising very quickly. So we've had over a foot of rise over the last week and expect this to rise much more quickly over the next week or two. This is the water that's flowing into Lac Seul from all sources, and it is, again, not quite double the 90th percentile, but very high and rising. Moving down from Lac Seul then, Lac Seul Dam, the Ear Falls Dam drains into the English River. This area at the top of the Middle English River watershed has an area called the Chikuni Packwash system, and there's a couple of, again, natural streams that come down through here. Exceptional flows pouring out of the Trout Lake River and Chikuni River, way above 90th percentile and just rising. So this is truly very high flows coming down into Packwash Lake. Packwash Lake gets the water that comes out of Lac Seul as well as the water coming down out of this system. And this pink line is the level of Packwash Lake. It has come up a couple of feet in the last week or so. Just downstream of Packwash is a OPG generating station, and generally the Packwash level can be held in a pretty narrow range, like around 20 centimeters, because that dam can kind of adjust the flows that are coming through there. Under these exceptionally high flows, however, this dam can no longer hold the level of Packwash Lake lower, even if they drop the level of the water upstream of the dam down by several feet. So it's no longer able to hold that level, and it will continue to rise as the flows continue to rise. Down in this area around Dryden, this is the Wabigoon River, which will flow up into the English River. This is a new all-time record, not just a May record for the Wabigoon River, and it's not just a new record, it's way above the previous record and still rising. So they're seeing local flooding effects here and infrastructure impacts, and main point being this is a huge amount of water entering the English River system just on its own, a very small watershed area. At Grassy Narrows along the English River, this isn't flow, it's the level of the river there. We're now above 90th percentile for May. This will continue to rise rapidly because of those upstream inputs that are also shooting up very quickly. So that's the English River Basin shifting downstream into, or to the south rather, into the Namakan Rainy Lake of the Woods system. This is the Vermilion River, which drains into Namakan Lake. It's generally a very small river, and in the summer you see a peak of about 25 to 30 cubic meters per second. It set a new all-time record. I think there's 40 some years of record there for this gauge, over 140, and it has peaked and it's dropping down to 125. Unlikely to see that peak again unless we get very wet weather, so it's encouraging that it's dropping, but it has a long way to go to get back down into the normal range. So that flows into Namakan Lake. I'll take a second here just to explain that Namakan Lake and Rainy Lake are both lakes with dams that are regulated, but they're regulated by the International Joint Commission. It's a separate board. The Lake of the Woods Control Board has no jurisdiction or authority over these lakes. So Namakan is the smaller of the two, and each of these lakes has what are called rule curves, and these are basically water level target ranges in the blue dashed lines throughout the year that the dam operators have to try to keep the lake level within. So the top panel here is the lake level for Namakan. And you can see they do a pretty good job keeping it in that band until we get into the third week of April and the flows just take off and they can't keep up. So the middle panel here is the amount of water flowing into Namakan Lake from all sources, above 90th percentile, quite a bit above. Inflow estimated at about 807. The outflow out of the dams at Namakan Lake is at 570, so quite a bit lower than the inflow. When there's more coming in than is going out, the lake level, of course, will rise. The red line shown here is the all gates open level. This is established by the International Joint Commission, and the dam operators basically have to fully open the dams at Namakan Lake at that point. If they haven't done so already, they actually did so a few weeks ago. So this lake level will continue to rise as long as the inflow stays above the outflow level. The 2014 peak is shown here in the dashed line, so we're about 2 feet away from that, a little less than 2 feet. Moving down into the Rainy sub-basin, so Namakan Lake empties directly into Rainy Lake, but one of the other major tributaries that flows into Rainy Lake is the Turtle River, which comes from the northern part in Ontario. Again, double 90th percentile flows here, exceptionally high and still rising. In past high water events, we've seen 190 cubic meters per second as kind of a rule of thumb threshold for when you might expect high water on Rainy Lake, and we blew through that last week. Down on Rainy Lake, again, has its own rule curves. The drought period last year was not able to stay within the rule curves, and then backed out of the upper rule curve here in April with the high flows coming in. The inflow to Rainy Lake is in the middle panel, up to 1,576. Now, the outflow out of the fully open dam at Fort Frances International Falls is shy of 1,000. So like 50% more flow coming in than is going out, which is resulting in rapid level rise of Rainy Lake. So Rainy Lake passed through the all gates open level for that lake earlier this week, and it will continue to rise until inflow can drop off. The 2014 peak is shown in red here, a little more than 2 feet above the current level. Moving down to the Rainy River Basin. So Rainy Lake is the headwaters for Rainy River, so the dams release flow right into the Rainy River. And there are a couple of other tributaries that flow. The Fork Rivers I mentioned earlier is shown in the photograph here, the Little Fork and the Big Fork, that flow directly into Rainy Lake. Typically, they're very low flows, but during the spring, we often see a spike. The spike this year was exceptionally high. So Little Fork River passing nearly 500 cubic meters per second at the peak at the end of April, and the Big Fork River over 300. So combined, they were passing nearly 800 cubic meters per second, which is more than was coming out of Rainy Lake at the time. Rainy River at Manitou Rapids, there is a gauge there. It's about halfway between International Falls and Lake of the Woods. And so it's a good measure of kind of halfway down the river. And we've got a couple of peaks with the different systems that have come through. Flow there now is around 1,500 cubic meters per second. And that includes the water that comes out of Rainy Lake as well as these two rivers because they're upstream of Manitou Rapids. The peak in 2014 was quite a bit higher than it is now at 21-22. It is unlikely, in my opinion, that we will see that peak unless we get some extremely wet weather in the next number of weeks. Because Rainy Lake is essentially opened up and it will only very gradually increase flow. And the Fork Rivers, they need a lot of additional rainfall to keep rising. They're very, what we call flashy. So unless they have a lot of fuel, they will gradually drop off here. So this is kind of one area of the basin where we're seeing some potentially positive news if the Fork Rivers can return back to the normal range. It will mean less flow into Lake of the Woods. But keep in mind, 1,500 halfway down the Rainy River coming into Lake of the Woods. Just for context, this was that same river, Big Fork, in August of last year. So you can see just kind of the response and the massive change that we've seen. So moving down to Lake of the Woods, a few more bits of information here. You'll remember we had 1,500 coming through Manitou Rapids at Rainy River. The total inflow to Lake of the Woods over the last 7 days on average is about 2,800 cubic meters per second, extremely high. And the peak here was actually higher than the peak in 2014 in terms of inflow to Lake of the Woods from all sources. The outflow out of Lake of the Woods with the dam fully opened as of last Saturday is only at 1,230, so less than half of the inflow. And as a result, the level of Lake of the Woods is rising very quickly, having come up over almost 3 feet since early April. The red line here it's not the all gates open level, but I guess you could think of it that way. This is the top of the operating range for Lake of the Woods that is set in the treaty between Canada and the US. So 323.47 or 1061.25 feet. We are now at 323.37 as of this evening. At 323.39, another inch, the International Lake of the Woods Control Board will be activated. And that is a 2-person board, 1 American, 1 Canadian. They're on the call here this evening. And they have to approve of any decisions of the Canadian Lake of the Woods Control Board for Lake of the Woods going forward, as long as the level is likely to be rising above the operating range. The 2014 peak is shown here at 323.78, so about 40 centimeters below the 2014 peak, and rising quickly. Moving down into the Winnipeg River then, this is the Norman Dam, which is now fully open, a picture from 2014. The level of the Winnipeg River, with the rapid opening over the last couple of weeks as the writing was on the wall in terms of what was happening in the watershed and all that April precipitation. The level here up many feet, you can see from 1039, sort of in mid-April, up to 1047, just as measured right below the dam, kind of in this area. So it's been a very rapid rise. The rise will continue, but very gradually. There'll be no more large jumps in the rise because the dam is fully opened. Down at Menaki, the White Dog Dam can typically keep the level of Menaki very flat, very stable. Menaki enjoys some of the most stable water levels in the whole watershed. But when flows get above a certain point coming out of Lake of the Woods, that White Dog Dam can no longer control the level at Menaki, and so we've seen several feet of rise in the last couple of weeks. The peak in 2014 at 317.54, again, about a foot above where we are today. Similar to just below Norman Dam, the level will rise here very gradually as the lake level comes up. I just want to explain why that is the case. So this is an aerial view of the north end of Lake of the Woods emptying into the Winnipeg River in Kenora, so going under the highway here, and then down to Norman Dam, which is pictured here. At very high flows, there are restrictions in this windy channel that constrain the flow, and the only way to get more flow through that channel is to raise the lake level and provide more pressure to push through the system. Once the dam is fully opened, as is pictured here, the dam is no longer controlling how much flow is coming out of Lake of the Woods. It's moved up, what we call the control. It's shifted upstream to this area here. And so as the lake level rises above the dam, so does the flow being pushed down through this channel and past the dam and into the river. So the higher the lake gets, the higher the flow gets in the Winnipeg River, and the higher the Winnipeg River level gets. Further downstream in Manitoba through the Whiteshell, we're seeing very high flows already, well above 90th percentile. The flow through Slave Falls, Manitoba Hydro Facility now at over 2,000 cubic meters per second. 2014 peak was around 2,600. The water level at Nudimick Lake, where there are a lot of cottages in the Whiteshell, is now at 276.25, and that's about 60 centimeters below the peak in 2014. There is a lot of water coming down both the English and the Winnipeg River systems, and those flows are increasing. these flows coming through Manitoba will continue to increase quickly. In the weeks ahead, a few points here to note: the Lac Seul and English River basins will remain high just due to snow melt. There's still a lot of snow up there that needs to melt. Any additional rainfall added onto this will just contribute to these exceptionally high flows and rising water levels. Down at Rainy and Namakan, those lakes will remain fully open until the lake levels get back down to those all gates open levels that were shown on the graphs. That will take a number of weeks. It's not just that when the lakes kind of reach a peak and start declining that those gates will start to be closed, which means they'll be at maximum possible flow for a number of weeks coming down through the system. Lake of the Woods will also continue to see rise until those local tributaries like the Big Fork and Little Fork drop significantly, because Rainy Lake will be at maximum flow for a number of weeks. That's the only opportunity that we'll see for a drop in inflow to Lake of the Woods. As Lake of the Woods rises, as just mentioned, so will the flows into the Winnipeg River and the water level in the Winnipeg River down all the way to White Dog. And the Winnipeg River level in Manitoba through the White Shell will see extremely high levels because of the combination of extreme flows coming out of both the English and Winnipeg River systems. So to kind of pull it all together, nearly all areas that we've looked at, because of these exceptional flows, are at risk of 2014 or higher levels, given that we're just really starting the wettest period of the year. It's not a guarantee we're going to see wet weather, but it certainly isn't unlikely. If it is very high, water levels could get higher than 2014. We need an extended dry period and getting into warmer weather, plant growth, et cetera, to start to see a return to normal levels in most areas, and that is going to take a while. So to review the key points that are presented here, again, by the end of March, certainly a moderately high snowpack in most areas, relatively higher around the Kenora area and up in the English River Basin. April record precip and a delayed thaw, so all this snow melt coming at once towards the end of the month into May. And the combination of rain on snow event plus frozen ground has led to this sort of perfect storm of flow situation. This has resulted in record flows across most areas of the basin for early May, and this timing is just not good as we set up into what is normally the wettest period of the year. So most areas will see many weeks of high water ahead. How long this lasts is entirely dependent on how much rain comes. We've got no control over that. In terms of the Lake of the Woods Control Board for the Lake of the Woods and Winnipeg River system, there are no more tools at the board's disposal. The dam is fully opened. Up in the Lac Seul Basin, Lac Seul will have to see further outflow increases before long because of the very rapid rise anticipated for the level of Lac Seul as well. And finally, 2014 or higher levels in most areas are possible, and again, dependent on how much rain we see.